She stood at the altar in that white lace gown, clutching the bouquet as if it were her lifeline. Michael's heart pounded so loud he thought the entire church would hear it. He'd walked her down the aisle, kissed her hand in front of 50 guests, and signed the marriage certificate. Yet at that moment, something just didn't add up. Her smile looked eerily familiar, as if it belonged to someone else. He forced a strained smile when the pastor said, "You may now kiss the bride." But inside, his mind raced. How could this be happening? How could the woman he just vowed to love be someone he'd known before, only he didn't realize it until everyone else saw it for what it was? On their wedding night, as they danced in the dimly lit reception hall, a single question haunted him. Did he just marry his own daughter? Welcome to Karma Strikes, where betrayal meets justice. Have you ever felt the world twist beneath you so fast that you couldn't catch your breath? Imagine standing at the altar, promising forever, only to realize you've given your heart to someone you shouldn't have loved. Michael thought he was living a new chapter of his life. He was a self-made man, proud father, and respected attorney. He believed he had denied his mistakes from 2 decades ago, but sometimes the past has a way of catching up in the most horrifying way. What would you do if you learned that the person you pledged your life to is not only hiding a secret, but is linked to you in the most forbidden way imaginable? Could you face that truth, or would you pretend it never existed? Tonight we peel back the layers of Michael's dark secret, one that shattered lives, twisted a family, and proved that karma doesn't rush, it never misses. Michael Anderson was the kind of man who believed he had it all under control. In his late 40s, he'd built a reputable law practice in Chicago, had 2 successful ventures, Roswell Private Investigations and Anderson Legal Consultants, and was the father of 2 children, Jack, a college freshman, and Emily, an accomplished violinist at a conservatory. He lived in a spacious loft downtown, drove a sleek black sedan, and was accustomed to respect wherever he went. People admired his tenacity, his sharp mind, and the facade of a devoted family man. Yet, 20 years earlier, Michael had made a mistake that haunted him more than he cared to admit. While a junior associate at a boutique firm, he had an affair with a woman named Laura Daly, a paralegal who was engaged to another associate. Their brief fling produced a daughter, Claire, whom Michael never saw, because her biological mother vanished the day she was born. No forwarding address, no explanation, nothing. Rumors whispered that Laura was a troubled soul, that she'd had Claire and left town to start fresh, but nobody knew for sure. Michael, desperate to protect his budding career and terrified of scandal, paid for Claire to be adopted under a false name. He never asked questions. He never saw a photograph. He convinced himself he'd done the right thing, that her adoptive parents would give her a better life. Years slipped by. Michael married his college sweetheart, Lily. They had Jack and Emily. They lived in the suburbs, coached Little League, hosted barbecues, everything that made up the American dream. He forged ahead, burying the past beneath praiseworthy accolades, community service, and late nights at the office. Occasionally, a pang of guilt stabbed him, like when he saw a little brunette girl playing in a stroller and wondered how Claire was doing. But those feelings were fleeting, drowned by new responsibilities. Then one chilly October evening, a chance encounter changed everything. Michael was invited to a charity gala at the Drake Hotel, where he met a young woman named Claire Matthews. She called herself Claire Matthews. She was charming, effortlessly intelligent, and described herself as a non-profit consultant focusing on at-risk youth. He didn't recognize her at first. She had inherited dark hair like his, a crooked smile reminiscent of Laura's photos he'd glimpsed once, and piercing green eyes that seemed to search his soul. They talked about legal aid clinics, social justice, and the city's underprivileged neighborhoods until the gala ended. Michael walked away thinking, she's someone I'll want to see again. Little did he know that Claire Matthews was actually his biological daughter, still carrying the last name of her adoptive parents and still unaware of her true origins. Over the next few weeks, Michael found himself making excuses to collaborate with her nonprofit. They attended board meetings together, lunched at the same spots, and laughed like old friends. His wife, Lily, thought Claire was one of his new pro bono clients. His children assumed Claire was a mentee. And Claire, a bright, driven woman in her mid-20s, trusted Michael's guidance as if he were an elder mentor. Everything seemed innocent. But as autumn turned to winter, pieces of a long-buried puzzle began to click into place. A misdelivered envelope from Laura's old attorney, a forgotten medical record buried in a stack of files, and finally, a photo of Laura holding baby Claire. Each clue chipped away at Michael's carefully constructed world. He'd come face to face with the daughter he thought would never exist, but he had no idea how painfully close she'd become. Can betrayal feel more crushing when it emerges from your own past? Michael was about to find out. The first time Michael saw the letter addressed to him, stamped with a faded postmark from May 2004, he almost tossed it into the shred bin. He was too busy finalizing a pro bono contract for Claire's nonprofit, reviewing depositions for an embezzlement case, and fielding calls about his daughter Emily's upcoming recital. But the envelope felt oddly heavy, its weight a silent pulse in his hand. He ripped it open at his desk late one night. Inside was a single-page memo from an attorney named Mark Reynolds, the same lawyer who had overseen the confidential adoption 20 years earlier. The memo read, "Mr. Anderson, enclosed is proof of payment for the adoption of Laura Daly's biological daughter, made under the name Claire Matthews. We have reason to believe Claire may not be aware of her parentage. If you wish to retrieve her records or take legal steps regarding custody, please contact our office by June 15th, 2024. After that date, the records will be sealed indefinitely. Sincerely, Mark Reynolds, Escow." Michael's stomach twisted into knots. He remembered Laura's face, the haunted look in her eyes when she handed over her newborn. He remembers the sound of that baby crying and how he sniffed at a tiny sock she'd pressed into his palm before disappearing into a waiting car. His heart had turned to ice, and he'd paid the lawyer without asking questions, desperate to erase the evidence. Now, 2 decades later, the past exploded back into his life in a neat envelope. He stared at the name Claire Matthews, scrawled on the memo, and thought of the woman he'd been working with for months. Claire Matthews, head of the nonprofit. Claire Matthews, smoking in the alley behind his office, complaining about City Hall. Claire Matthews, laughing over coffee. He replayed their conversations in his mind, searching for any hint she'd mentioned her birth year. No, she'd always said she was 25. Michael did the math. If she was 25 in 2024, she'd been born in 1999, exactly when Laura disappeared. He sank into his chair, palms sweating. Could it be? Could he have been guiding his own daughter's projects, unaware of the connection? Guilt seared his chest like acid. He closed his eyes, rocking back and forth. Fear clouded his judgment. He considered shredding the letter, pretending it never arrived. If Claire discovered the truth, her life would shatter, just like his. 5 minutes later, though, Michael's conscience overruled his fear. How could he keep this secret? He had to know for sure. He gathered every adoption document he could find, dated birth certificates, the receipt for the biometric footprints Laura had provided, a faded photo of baby Claire with a name that matched the one Claire Matthews used. Still, Michael needed incontrovertible evidence. He hired a private investigator, Roswell PI, his own company's subsidiary, to discreetly dig into Claire's background. He justified it as due diligence, because what father could leave such a question unresolved? Meanwhile, Claire floated through her days with a quiet optimism. She didn't have a mother. Laura had vanished when she was an infant, and her adoptive parents, the Matthews household, had always loved her. But she'd sensed a missing piece. Growing up, she'd wondered about her birth mother's fate, but her adoptive parents feared that digging would bring heartbreak. Claire had accepted that. She found purpose in her work, teaching troubled teens to read, lobbying for foster children, and raising funds for youth centers. She believed she was exactly where she belonged. One frosty morning in November, as Michael inadvertently admired Claire's unwavering dedication during a board meeting, the phone rang in his office. It was the investigator. "Mr. Anderson, I have something you need to see. It's better if I show you in person." Michael closed his briefcase, palms trembling. He felt the blood in his veins freeze as he thought of Claire waiting in the conference room. The same conference room where she'd once stared out at the city skyline and confessed to him, "I sometimes feel like I don't belong anywhere." That day he'd said, "You belong wherever your heart leads you." How could he ever face her again with the letter in his hand? 20 minutes later, Michael entered the small interrogation-style room at Roswell, PI. The investigator slid a manila folder across the table. In it were redacted medical records, adoption paperwork, and, most damningly, a DNA report. It compared Claire's sample with a known sample from the original daily files. Dad had secretly provided a cheek swab when he first set this in motion so many years ago. The results were unmistakable, 99.9% genetic match. The report concluded, Claire Matthews is the biological daughter of Michael Anderson. Michael's world exploded. The phone buzzed in the pocket of his suit jacket. Claire's number. A lump formed in his throat. What would he say to her? That he'd betrayed her trust his entire life? That all the encouraging words he'd whispered in her ear were tainted by a secret so dark he couldn't let her know? Tears blurred his vision. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Guilt and shame coiled around him like a vice. In that moment, he realized that every interaction, every laugh they'd shared over the past 2 months had been a lie, because he'd unknowingly fallen in love with his own daughter. Could you even imagine the horror of that revelation? The betrayal is twofold. His soul betrayed his moral code, and fate betrayed him by bringing Claire into his life in the worst way possible. Outside the door, Claire was wrapping up her presentation. She would walk into this room and see his face contort in terror, and he would have to tell her, "I am your father." The words felt impossible to speak, like dragging a broken body across splintered glass. The world as he knew it unraveled in those moments. Michael knew there was no going back. Karma doesn't rush, but it never misses. And right now, he was discovering just how precise its aim could be. Michael left the PI office with his head spinning. He paid the investigator, shook his hand, and walked back to his car in a haze. The November air bit into his lungs as he drove to the firm, where he found Claire pacing nervously outside his office door. Her expression lit up when she saw him. "Michael, did you have a chance to review the latest grant proposal?" she asked, clutching a stack of folders. He forced a smile, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes. I actually wanted to talk to you about it right now." He motioned for her to enter. The door clicked shut behind them, and the lie grew heavy on his tongue. As Claire sat down, her brown eyes bright with trust, Michael could almost convince himself this was just another meeting, until he noticed the way her fingers tapped the table, how she rocked forward like she could sense something was off. He fumbled for an opening. "Claire, there's something I need to tell you. It's delicate." He cleared his throat. "I've been doing some background research strictly to make sure your nonprofit's finances are airtight, but I stumbled onto something that has nothing to do with your organization." He paused. She frowned. confusion flickering across her face. He clenched his fists. "Claire, you're 25 now, right?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, 25. She leaned back, folding her arms. "Is everything okay?" Michael swallowed hard. He reached into his jacket pocket and slid the DNA report across the table. "I'm so sorry, Claire. I should have told you sooner, but I discovered that your birth mother, Laura Daly, and we had a child together, and—" He choked on the words. "That child is you." Claire's eyes widened. Her face went pale. She blinked at the papers as if willing them to change shape. This can't be real," she whispered. Her voice cracked. She stood abruptly, palms pressed against the edge of the table. What are you saying?" Michael's chest tightened. "I know it sounds insane. The adoption records, the DNA, they all match. You're my daughter." For a long moment she stared. Then her expression morphed into disbelief, and tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. I was told I was adopted, yes, but no one ever mentioned who my biological parents are." He lowered his head. "Laura paid for your adoption under a false name. I was terrified of ruining my career, my marriage. I thought giving you up would give you a better life than I could. I didn't know you'd come back into my world like this." She sank into the chair, covering her face with her hands. For 10 seconds, he couldn't look at her, afraid of what her next words might be. Rage? Disgust? Fear? Then suddenly she jerked her head up, cheeks stained with tears. "How could you? You used me. All those conversations, all those moments, you were lying to me." Michael's throat closed. "I never meant to lie. I thought I was protecting you and me." The words hung in the air like a death knell. Claire's face twisted with betrayal. "Protecting you? You didn't protect me. You robbed me of my identity." She clutched the armrests, knuckles white. "What do I do now? Who am I?" Michael's mind raced. He had always believed that if he swallowed his guilt, no one else would ever know. But now, the truth was laid bare before the daughter he'd unknowingly courted as a friend, even on their wedding day, though the wedding was still weeks away. He felt bile rise in his throat. Wedding. He'd invited Claire to be his daughter's maid of honor. He'd written a speech praising her resilience and kindness. How could he tell his wife, Lily, his son, Jack? How could he face Emily on her wedding day, knowing he had become part of her own nightmare? Over the next few days, Michael tried in vain to fix things. He begged Claire to stay silent while he figured out what to do. He thought he could navigate the legal maze quietly. Annulments, sealed records, perhaps move her to a different state to shield her from gossip. But Claire was inescapably angry. She refused to let him erase her existence. She stormed into his office that Wednesday morning, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. "I'm calling my adoptive parents." Her voice shook with rage. "I deserve to know everything." Michael sank into his chair, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for days. He closed his eyes. "Okay, but please, let me talk to Lily first. Let me figure something out." Claire's eyes flicked to the window. Outside, snow began to fall, coating the city in a gray hush. "I don't want to wait." Michael opened his mouth to protest, but something in her tone snapped him out of his paralysis. She was growing up before his eyes, angry, determined, and ready to tear down everything he'd built. He realized he couldn't manipulate her, couldn't protect her from this truth. She deserved agency. And so, with trembling hands, he called Lily. The sound of her voice, warm and slightly distracted as she packed for Emily's recital, was a dagger. He hung up before she said hello because he couldn't say it. Not yet. That night, Claire spent hours poring over the adoption records, looking for clues about her biological mother. She discovered that Laura Daly's file listed Michael Anderson as the father, but no other details. She sent emails to the attorney, demanded transcripts, and studied medical reports for any hints of Laura's fate. Meanwhile, Michael reached out to Mark Reynolds to explore the possibility of reversing the adoption. He worried that if Claire tried to reclaim her birth identity, she might lose the only family she'd ever known. At home, Lily sensed the tension immediately. Michael's eyes were haunted. He barely touched his dinner, and his normally jovial banter about Emily's performance was replaced by a grim silence. She stayed up in bed until well past midnight, lying awake as Michael paced the loft, his footsteps echoing across the hardwood floors. The next morning, Michael sat Claire down again, this time at a local coffee shop. The air between them simmered with anger and heartbreak. Claire stared at her latte, tears brimming. "I spoke to my adoptive parents," she said. "They're heartbroken. They never wanted to lie to me, but they didn't know. They didn't know you were out there." Michael reached for her hand, but she pulled back. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Her voice trembled with hurt. He exhaled slowly. "I'm going to talk to Lily. Then we'll decide what's best for you." She stood abruptly, pushing in her chair. "You should have thought about that before you let me call you Dad." She turned and walked away, leaving Michael alone with his guilt. Over the next week, Claire refused to see him. She skipped meetings, left phone calls unanswered, and even took a leave of absence from her nonprofit. Without Michael's guidance, the organization's budget negotiations stalled. The board began to question why their charismatic leader had vanished so suddenly. The tension spilled into Michael's work. Clients noticed the strain, colleagues whispered. Every time he tried to think of a solution, he found himself trapped by the same reality. He had to make things right with Claire, but he didn't know where to start. He couldn't just pretend this never happened. Late one night, after an argument with Lily about whether they should tell Jack and Emily, Michael realized that he needed to pay someone else to help their daughter find closure. He contacted a renowned genetic counselor, Dr. Susan Reynolds, whose anonymity he hoped would allow Claire to open up without fear. He arranged for Claire to receive a packet of DNA testing services under a pseudonym, something he could at least control. If she refused to speak to him, perhaps a third party could guide her through the emotional minefield of discovering her identity. But when the test kit arrived at Claire's apartment, care of Mr. A. Johnson, her instincts told her someone was manipulating events. She threw the package across the room, cursing the mystery. "I need to do this on my own terms," she muttered to herself. As Thanksgiving approached, Michael realized that the lie between them had become an unbreachable chasm. He and Lily had to invite Claire to dinner. Lisa, his older sister, had insisted, knowing that truths would spill over the table like unshed tears. Michael didn't sleep for 3 nights. He scribbled notes about what he'd say, changed them, crumpled them, then rewrote them at 3 a.m. When the day arrived, he watched Claire walk through the door, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Lily hugged her with a trembling tenderness, then guided her to a seat at the table. Jack lingered in the hallway, shock evident in his eyes. He thought Claire was just Dad's new protege. Emily hovered by the refrigerator, violin bow in hand, uncomprehending. Michael looked at his family, at Claire, and felt the weight of his secret crush his chest. How could he confess that he'd fallen in love with her while still hiding the truth? By the time the turkey was carved, no words had been said. The room was thick with unspoken accusations, and the scent of roasted sage and cranberries couldn't mask the tension. At last, Claire stood and silenced everyone with a single sentence. "I know who my father is." A hush fell. Michael's fork clattered on the plate. Lily gasped. Jack's mouth dropped open. Emily's violin bow slipped from her hand. In that moment, he knew the next steps. Full confession, public exposure, legal fallout. The only question was how much damage he could still prevent before this story consumed them all. The Thanksgiving table felt like the eye of a hurricane, calm on the surface, but roiling with force just beneath. Claire rose from her seat, eyes aflame, and took a shaky breath. Michael felt every pulse in his body like an army of locusts devouring his composure. He braced himself for the inevitable. "I didn't just find out that Michael Anderson is my father," Claire said, tone icy. "I also found out he asked a PI to dig into my life, tampered with my DNA test kit, and tried to erase any paper trail of my true identity, all while he was courting me, pretending to be my friend." Michael's pulse quickened. He opened his mouth, but Lily's hand on his arm stopped him. Everyone in the room turned to look at him, jaws slack. He realized that from this moment on, his life would never be the same. He forced himself to speak, voice barely above a whisper. "Claire, I never meant to lie. I fell in love with you not knowing you were my daughter. The man I was 2 decades ago made a terrible decision, and the man I am now can't undo what was done. I've been trying to protect you." Claire's eyes glistened with tears. "Protect me? By keeping me in the dark my entire life? By making me feel safe as I fell in love with you?" She looked at Lily, who had tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mom, tell him what he is. Tell him what he did to me." Lily's voice trembled. "Claire, your father didn't know. He thought you were just a protege, a young woman needing guidance. I didn't know either. When Michael told me, I was so angry, but he begged me not to tell anyone, not to ruin your life." Claire shook her head, back straight. "I don't care about my life anymore, Mom. All I see is the years I've lost, the trust you all stole from me." She turned back to Michael. "I want the public to know. I want people to see what happens when someone tries to erase a person's existence." Michael closed his eyes, tears falling unchecked. He had already imagined every scenario: newspaper headlines, televised news segments, late-night talk show debates, that moment when Jack would be confronted by classmates in college. He thought of Emily's violin scholarship being overshadowed by this scandal. He wanted to shield them, but Claire refused to be silenced. He nodded slowly. "Okay, we'll do it your way." Claire pulled out her phone and began typing unconcerned tweets. "I am Claire Anderson Matthews. This man," she pointed at Michael, "is my father. He tried to hide me for 25 years. I forgive him for his ignorance, but the world needs to know the truth." Within 20 minutes, the words were out. First sent to a local journalist friend of Claire's, then retweeted by community leaders, then published by the Chicago Tribune with the headline, "She thought he was her mentor. He was her father." Millions of views exploded overnight. The fallout was seismic. The next morning, Michael woke to his phone vibrating non-stop. Voicemails from clients ending retainer agreements, jeers from people on the street, emails from colleagues saying they couldn't be associated with him. Someone had hacked into the firm's online board and posted photos of baby Claire with Michael's face superimposed on the cradle, a shocking, grotesque meme that trended on Twitter under Agdar Incest Lawyer. At the courthouse, where Michael and Lily once sat in the pews for community events, news crews had set up tents. Reporters asked him to comment on whether the affair with Laura had been consensual, whether charges should be filed for statutory rape, and whether he intended to seek custody of Claire. Lily hid behind him, crying into his jacket as cameras flashed. Inside those courthouse walls, Claire sat before a packed room, her adoptive parents at her side. She announced she was officially changing her legal name back to Claire Matthews and severing any confidentiality that kept the adoption sealed. She told the judge, I want to ensure that no one else is robbed of their identity the way I was. The judge suspended her father's legal license indefinitely pending a full referendum. Jack, watching from the gallery, realized that all the respect he had for his father was a facade. Classmates in New York called him Patriarch's son as a slur. Emily closed herself off completely, skipping rehearsals, and withdrew her scholarship applications, afraid people would dig into her father's scandal and destroy her career. Michael felt as though he was drowning. Each breath was a reminder of how badly he'd failed his daughter, his wife, and his children. The karma he had thought he could outrun had struck with full force. He'd built his life on a lie, and now every corner of his world was collapsing. Weeks passed in a blur of legal hearings, media appearances, and emotional breakdowns. Claire became a reluctant figurehead for adoption rights, giving interviews about the emotional toll of discovering one's biological family under such circumstances. She spoke at rallies. Adopted children deserve the right to know their birth parents. No child should feel like a secret. Her words resonated with thousands of adoptees and birth mothers who'd been silenced. Meanwhile, Michael retreated to a small cottage in Lake Michigan, offered by his older sister Lisa, who insisted he needed space to reflect. He spent his days writing apology letters to his children, volunteering at a men's mental health shelter, and slowly accepting that he might never practice law again. His reputation was shattered, his marriage irreparable, and his children, once the cornerstones of his pride, now saw him as the architect of their pain. Yet, in moments of desperate clarity, Michael realized that this was exactly the justice he deserved. He asked himself, how can you expect mercy from a world when you withheld it from your own daughter? The question echoed in his mind like a mantra. Karma doesn't rush, but it never misses. One bitterly cold December morning, Michael received a handwritten letter from Claire. Dear Dad, thank you for letting me speak my truth. I won't pretend that I understand everything you did or why you did it, but I do know this. Secrets have a way of suffocating the soul. I'm moving to Seattle to start fresh, away from the glare of media. I'll always be family, but right now, I need distance to heal. Forgive me if I never call again. Claire. Michael held the letter long after the tears had blurred the ink. He folded it carefully and placed it above his desk, his last connection to a daughter now lost to him. Outside, the first snowfall of December drifted down, dusting the ground in white. It felt fitting, a cold, quiet reminder that the world moves forward, even when you're stuck in the wreckage of your own choices. By March, Michael had sold his Chicago loft, settled debts with the firm's clients, and donated the proceeds to an adoption advocacy group. He penned an op-ed for the Chicago Tribune. To every adult who finds themselves trapped by past mistakes, know this. The only way to move forward is to face the truth, no matter how painful. He signed it. Michael Anderson, former attorney. He lost everything that defined him. His career, his family's intact image, his children's trust. And yet, in that wreckage, he found a strange sense of purpose, to prevent other fathers from burying the past. He knew he could never atone fully, but at least he could try to stop another story like his. When Claire's adoptive parents invited him to a quiet memorial service for Laura, who'd passed away in a car accident 3 years prior, Michael declined. He simply couldn't face the ghosts of his past just then. Perhaps one day he'd find a way to say goodbye properly. But for now, he accepted that his life would be defined by that one terrible decision. As he looked out at Lake Michigan's icy expanse, he whispered, "Karma doesn't forgive, but it teaches." Nearly a year had passed since Claire Matthews opened Pandora's box in Michael's life. He no longer recognized the man he'd been. Arrogant, self-important, convinced that money and power could bury any mistake. He had been broken, splintered, and remade by the very secret he'd tried so hard to hide. In that time, Claire found solace in Seattle's misty mornings, working as a counselor for adopted teens. She built a new life advocating for adoptions that were transparent, respectful, and ethical. At night, she still felt the ache of her lost father, but she channeled that pain into purpose, supporting young people who felt like strangers in their own families. And she discovered that forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It frees you to move forward. Michael settled into a modest apartment in Evanston, Illinois. No more downtown loft, no more luxury cars. He traded courtroom battles for quiet sessions at Rosewood Community Center, where he led a weekly support group for men rebuilding their lives. The irony wasn't lost on him. Once a polished lawyer whose voice carried authority, now a humble volunteer counselor whose greatest lesson was always speak the truth. His children, Jack and Emily, slowly reconciled with him. At first, they kept their distance. Emily refused to play the violin, and Jack dropped out of school for a semester, overwhelmed by guilt by association. But Michael never gave up trying to prove he was more than his worst sin. He sent Emily recordings of violin performances anonymously. She found them weeks later and learned he'd donated to her scholarship fund. Jack discovered a journal Michael kept, filled with remorse and a commitment to honesty. Using those small gestures, Michael began to rebuild trust, brick by painful brick. One crisp spring afternoon, Jack knocked on Michael's door. The two sat in the living room overlooking the lake. Jack looked older, shoulders broader, eyes more wary. He cleared his throat. "Dad, I've been accepted to a law program in New York." Michael's heart swelled, but he forced a steady smile. "That's great, Jack." Jack sighed. "I know you messed up, but I also know how much it cost you. You chose to tell the truth when you could have spent the rest of your life hiding. I want to do the same. Could I intern at your community center this summer?" Michael's eyes welled with tears. He reached across the coffee table, placing his hand over Jack's. "I'd be honored, son." Meanwhile, Emily auditioned for Juilliard and was accepted, finally believing her talent could rise above her father's disgrace. She wrote him a note. "You taught me that mistakes are part of life. How I overcome them is what matters." Michael folded the note and tucked it into his wallet like a sacred talisman. But the greatest test came one gray autumn day when an envelope arrived, postmarked from Seattle. Claire had written him a letter, her first direct communication in nearly a year. He opened it with trembling hands. "Dear Dad, I've spent the last year trying to understand how someone could hide me from myself. I've learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about deciding to see the person behind the pain. I've started a new nonprofit called Truth and Roots, dedicated to helping adopted children reunite with birth families when both parties consent. I'm sending you a seed packet of white lilies, my favorite flower that always reminds me of hope. Plant them by the window where light streams in. They need patience to bloom, just like forgiveness. I know we may never have the father-daughter relationship I once dreamed of, but I wanted you to know that somehow I've made peace with the past. I hope you can find peace too. Love, Claire." He clutched the seed packet, tears streaming down his face. Outside, leaves swirled in the wind, painting the ground gold and crimson. It felt as if nature itself was whispering a promise. Time flows forward, carrying us beyond our darkest moments. Michael planted the lilies by his bay window. Each day, he watered them gently, feeling the earth shift beneath his fingers. He thought of Claire's resilience, Lily's heartbreak, Jack's strength, and Emily's redemption. He realized that life, like a seed, needs darkness before it can reach the light. On the day the lilies blossomed, he sat in his empty living room, the white petals glowing in the late afternoon sun. He whispered to the empty space, "Karma taught me my lessons, but I taught myself to listen." To his community, Michael wrote a short op-ed for the Evanston Gazette titled Seeds of Truth. In it, he recounted a condensed version of his story, admitting his past mistakes, celebrating the people who held him accountable, and urging others to face their secrets before those secrets faced them. He ended with, "Karma doesn't rush, but it never misses. And if you let it, it can be the greatest teacher you'll ever know." The reaction was overwhelming. People wrote him letters, some forgiving, some skeptical, but many inspired to make amends in their own lives. He received an invitation to speak at a national adoption conference alongside Claire, who had become a prominent voice in the movement. They debated openly, sometimes heatedly, about ethics, transparency, and healing. In those moments, he realized forgiveness was not just about absolving the past, but building a future where others could break the cycle of hidden truths. As winter melted into spring, Michael and Claire stood together at a Truth and Roots fundraising gala. The tension that once charged the air between them had softened into a fragile understanding. Claire, wearing a simple silk dress, approached him. She held out a single white lily from the vase at her table. Michael accepted it, choking back tears. He looked at her and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to forgive myself." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I'm not sure we'll ever be the family we once dreamed of," she said softly. "But I'll always be grateful that we can walk forward, separately, yet together." He squeezed her hand. "We'll find our way." And as they faced the assembled guests, some smiling, some teary-eyed, they saw a world that wasn't perfect, but was trying to learn from its mistakes. Michael thought of the lilies by his window, how they had survived the coldest season to bloom in the warmth of spring light. In that moment, he understood. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about growth. So, to you who've watched Michael's story unfold, what secrets are you hiding that might one day find you? If karma is only a teacher, what lessons are you ready to learn? And remember, schema thrives in the dark, but every seed yearns for the sun. Stay tuned to Karma Strikes for more stories of truth, betrayal, and the quiet power of redemption. If you found this story powerful, hit that like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe, because the next chapter is always written by those brave enough to face their own darkness.